Hovering atop his catacomb command barge over the wreckage, the mighty Pharaon looked out on endless fields of broken and twisted metal. All the banners and accoutrements of a once mighty dynasty lay littering the field. Carnage wrought by the great devourer, the Tyranids. The battle had been hard fought, he had no doubt, but the matter was now over, or so most would think. The planet had been stripped bare of every last shred of biological substance, every last animal, bird, fish, leaf, blade of grass, even microscopic bacteria. It was now a world devoid of even the potential for life. When the hive fleets passed over a world, they picked it cleaner than a swarm of locusts' rotting carcass. But where the locusts would feast only on the flesh, the Tyranid also consumed the very bones. They left nothing. At least, this is what the teeming hordes of the lesser races believed. The Necrons now knew better. For in the wake of the Tyranids was left much that was of value to the undying armies of the dynasties. Precious metals and ores remained, but more than this. For the Necrons' very bodies would be left where they fell, be it ripped asunder by huge talons, crushed under the foot of gargantuan bio-titans, or simply overwhelmed and pulled apart by the swarms of their lesser organisms. But the carcasses, despite being beyond their own ability to reconstitute themselves, were not entirely useless. Far from it. The Pharaon regally observed the activity across the entire valley, the ghost arks filling the skies and descending down to meticulously scour every last inch for their bounty. As hundreds of arks went about their business, he could see them collecting piece after piece, nothing whatsoever being left behind. A mundane task that the Pharaon knew was necessary, but felt was utterly beneath him. But he no longer felt the sting to his prestige so keenly, not like he would when he was a living being, a Necrontier lord. The chevrons on his displays were all overlain with the one sigil that he had always known, even above that of his own family, his own dynasty, that of their lord returned. In the tiniest remaining fraction of his mind that was not entirely metal and hate and revenge, he could almost recall images, fleeting memories. Visions of the Triarchs who had assailed him in his very throne room. They had simply arrived and rushed into his palace, their metal forms immune to the vast majority of his men's existing weaponry, his honor guard cut down with contempt by these undying horrors. They seemed soulless. He could see no spark in any of their lampant green eyes, no restraint, no resistance to their masters. This was an anathema to him and all of his living people. The Necrontier who resisted the dreaded death of the Catan that their lord and master, their kings, were enforcing on every last one of their people. He vaguely remembered, like through a fog, his shouting, his hatred, his pain at the taking of his family, his guards, his entire court. How they had assailed him, these warriors of the Triarch. How they had swept aside his blade and simply grabbed him, and with all of his people, they had been marched to the machines. Those great furnaces that transmogrified, transformed them. The vehicles of the change. The factories that had ended the Necrontier as a race, and replaced them with the soulless and mainly automata of their Necrons. The Pharaon knew that he was not who he once was. He had no passion, no verve. He did not laugh, as he was known to do. His belly roars, his sign that he was their Pharaon. He was the only one of them who could endure the pain, the constant suffering of their existence, and yet laugh. He was their lord, and he was their light, and he was always their better. It was his goal, to be the only man of his people who had the sheer willpower, the discipline, to not only endure the endless suffering, but to scoff at it, to riz it, to be ribald when all else were melancholy and simpering. He knew deep down that he had lost so much in the pact that garnered them all immortality. But now he was unable to truly remember why he resisted. It had been so long ago. He also worked under the constant state of semi-concentration, clawing at the back of his mind, his now cybernetic cortex. He knew something was wrong. He knew he should even hate their overlord, their king. But his rage was now all he had left, the one facsimile of true emotion that remained, and it was not directed at their king. The sigil did not engender utter mindless obedience, but it was pointless to resist, and nor would he. For the dangers that were in this galaxy, from both its residents and these new interlopers, they were simply too much for the Necrons to do anything but bend the knee. If they did not unite, then they would be swept away, something he would never allow. And hence he had been ordered to traverse the webway, travelling along a current ripped open by a dolmen gate, and into the wake of the Tyranid advance. He was to efficiently and swiftly gain the resources required for a protracted engagement, a war of attrition, if need be. For the Ghost Arks were collecting every last piece of the Necrons who had been so thoroughly trounced by the bugs. But then they would be merged, healed, repaired, and reconstituted. The legions that once stood tall in this valley, hundreds of thousands of warriors were to be returned to the fight. Surely, not many would be whole recoveries. Many would be patchwork chimeras of many a warrior, but they would be Necron. They would fight as directed. And that was needed now more than ever. Oricon himself had been consulted, along with the others in the entourage, the court of the king. The confrontation that was about to occur on this one seemingly insignificant lush green world would be a crux point. A fire that would bring many moths. A smelting pot of destruction that would be one of the most important confrontations the galaxy had seen since the Old Ones still stalked the galaxy, before they had been crushed by the Necrons, millions of years ago. And the Necrons would need be the victors in part, if not in total, for their manifest destiny to be realized. The children of the Old Ones and the scum that had dragged themselves from oceans since the Necrons began their sleep so many millions of years. They arrived in their droves, in their legions, and they had not one clue what resided beneath the surface of the planet they were about to run amok on. They simply had no clue what was about to be released if the Necrons failed. The Pharaons spent the next weeks plying the entire system, collecting, ever collecting, until finally it was time to rejoin the muster. When his ships finally made their way to that one spot, he witnessed something he had not seen in millions of years, a rare thing even then, for in his scopes were hundreds of capital ships, more arriving with every second as he approached. The lesser races were about to find out how the war in heaven had been waged. They were about to face the fully awakened, fully equipped, fully organized, and expertly directed forces of the Necrons. For this was no mere fleet collecting in the shadows between the systems. This was an armada. Welcome, gentle listener. I'm Baldermort, your faithful servant, and I wish to introduce you to the forces, factions, and war gear of the grim darkness of the far future of Warhammer 40k. We are to discuss an ancient horror, a weapon of war that is older than perhaps any other you will come across. Perhaps the Ghost Ark, a Necron weapon of intense power, but perhaps not in the more obvious way of those that level mountains and make the skies turn to fire. For the very basics, let us lean on existing wisdom. To quote, Ghost Arks. There have been Ghost Arks since the very earliest days of the Necron tier. Then they were simply wooden carriages, pulled by toiling beasts of burden, commissioned by families of the dead to convey corpses from their homes to the places of interment. Thousands of years later, at the time of biotransference, the now motorized ghost arks took on darker connotations. Guided by grim-faced soldiers, they prowled the streets of the great cities. No longer was their business with the dead, but with the living, for they were the means by which unwilling citizens were dragged through the great transformative machines. Though the leaders of the Necron tier had pledged their allegiance to the Catan, few of the common people wished for the change that was upon them. So did the ghost arks often convey the broken bodies of those beaten near unto death by the government's enforcers, for only a spark of life and memory was required for biotransference. As resistance grew, the ghost arks were crewed no longer by soldiers of flesh and blood, but by the very first wave of converted Necrons. And with that, all pretense at mercy and compassion ended. With each load of living cargo the ghost arks claimed, their reputation grew ever darker and their aspect ever more bleak. By the time biotransference was almost complete, the mere sight of a ghost ark was enough to provoke terror in those observers who could any longer feel such things. Those still living who saw the ghost arks about their work swore that the tortured souls of their victims flew thick about the wagons, haunting the air with mournful voices. Much has changed for the Necrons in the countless millennia since, and the role of the ghost ark has changed with it. No longer the jailers of the living, they are now the redeemers of the fallen, tasked with trawling the battlefields or remnants of Necrons no longer able to reconstruct themselves. Recovered components are then set upon by swarms of constructor scarabs. Working with near-silent efficiency, they return the fallen Necron to function if repairs are possible, or dissolve it into reusable raw energy if they are not. Repaired Necrons are then locked in stasis until the ghost ark is at capacity, at which point it will either return its salvaged cargo to their tomb world, or else deploy them directly to the battlefield. Ghost arks are often pressed into service as conventional transport vehicles, conveying reinforcements to some vital area of the battlefield, or allowing Necron forces to attack from an unexpected quarter. The enemy's predicament is made all the worse by the fact that Necrons deployed in this fashion are, to all intents and purposes, accompanying their own mobile repair station. Only by destroying the ghost ark can the foe have any hope of victory. Since the coming of the Tyranid High Fleets to the eastern fringe, the Charnavok dynasty has fielded a great many ghost arks. The overlords of the scattered Charnavok holdings were swift to realize that where the Tyranids consumed all living tissue, much of the mineral bounty of their prey worlds were left behind. This knowledge was hard-earned indeed. Millions of Necrons lay shattered or maimed beyond self-recovery, or even phase parameters, across the lands of the Charnavok realms. Instead of harnessing the mineral bounty of the dead worlds in the path of each biofleet to create new warriors, the cryptex and canoptic constructors of the dynasty built entire fleets of ghost arks from the wreckage of worlds stripped of biomass by the all-devouring swarms. Networks of these craft then combed the lifeless wastelands in exhaustive grid patterns, picking up the disembodied remains of fallen Necrons and reconstituting them into humanoid form once more. Necessity demanded that the cryptex relax their reunification parameters, given the violence with which the swarm tore apart those who stood against them. As a result, the legions of Necrons that lurch reanimated from the Charnavok Armada are as likely to be patchwork constructs as they are shining warriors of one hue. End quote. The Ghost Ark. Now usually, I would wax lyrical about its import, its use, perhaps even the models, but you may have noticed I am slightly more growly than usual today. I have to admit that I have a bit of a frog in my throat, so will not be extending this entry. But I want you to know that another reason for this is that I will be showing you how this particular weapon is of such import, even more so than in the story at the beginning of this entry. I look forward to the narrative continuing and us seeing, so to put it, the devastating strategic import and terrifying ramifications of their deployment in protracted campaigns. I hope you will join me on the journey when it begins in earnest. at abundance, Tertius. Soon. I have been Baldermort, your faithful servant. I hope you've enjoyed this brief introduction to the Ghost Ark. If so, then please do consider liking and subscribing, and hitting the notification button if you do so, as I would not want you to miss out. Now, no matter what you do today, do try to make some time for fun. Toodaloo.